possible and inviting all of you to take part. I do appreciate that there are a group of people in the Middleton area who want to talk about elections at this time. So we're going to try to walk our way through it in a sensible fashion. There will be time for questions at the end of my presentation. We'll be using the chat function in Zoom. So I will see those questions. Feel free to type them in throughout the talk, but also at the end of the talk, we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes working our way through those. So this is a look at the 2020 presidential election from the perspective of a political scientist, which may be a different perspective than you have or that you have experienced. It's an attempt to put the science into political science. So I will be sharing with you some graphs and tables and kind of the social scientific way that political scientists would analyze what's happening in the election, really looking for patterns and historical regularities that we can expect in 2020, and then thinking about ways in which 2020 might deviate from those. So you may be here for an answer as to which of these gentlemen is likely to be elected president in November. You may have feelings about these people. You may prefer one of them. One of them will be elected, and I'm going to try to give you some sense as to which way the indicators are pointing, at least today. There's a lot to happen, I suspect, between June 18th and November 3rd. But I do want to give you a sense for where things are now and what kinds of indicators you might be watching as the campaign unfolds that would give you a clue as to who has the upper hand going into November. But I will start with a little bit of a sneak peek. This is a forecast based on the polls, as you've probably seen, national polls asking people who they're likely to vote for, but also what we think of as the fundamental forces behind elections. Things like the state of the economy are also in this model. This comes from The Economist magazine, and you can find it online. And you can see the trend here has been one of pretty consistent advantage for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And that advantage has been growing over time. Back in March, when the primaries were still happening, Biden had a lead of about 5 points. That has grown today to about 8 points and looks to be accelerating. You can see that the lines are moving apart as we approach today. So there has been actually a lot of activity in the last 10 days or so that has worked to Biden's favor. So if the election were to happen today, I have no doubt that Joe Biden would win the popular vote. And in November, you'd have to say, given where we are today, he's a very strong favorite to win the popular vote in November as well. But that's somewhat different than winning the presidency, which requires putting together votes in the Electoral College. So I also want to show you what The Economist had to say about its forecast for the Electoral College. So in the figure at the bottom, you see all 50 states lined up from left to right, with the most Democratic states over on the left. They are a sure thing for Biden, places like California. The most Republican states out on the right, those are a sure thing for Trump. And then in the middle is where it gets fuzzy. And there are states that are leaning a little bit in Biden's direction or leaning in Trump's direction. You might remember that there are 538 electoral votes. And to win, a candidate needs 270 of those, or a majority. And so you can see that the projection today is that Wisconsin would be just on the side of Biden and would probably not be the state that puts him over the top. That's actually Pennsylvania, according to this forecast. But all of those Midwestern states that were battlegrounds last time around are likely to be battlegrounds this time around. And at least at the moment, even with the undecided states of Arizona, North Carolina, Ohio, and Georgia up for grabs, it looks like Biden is in a strong position to win not only the popular vote, but the Electoral College vote as well. This would be a pretty stunning result for an incumbent president to lose by a margin of this size. And again, it may not be this margin by November, but I do just want to point out, and I think you'll see as we go along, how exceptional this is for an incumbent president, given the advantages that most incumbents have when it comes to be election time. So let me say one more word about the Electoral College, because it is the mechanism that the founders wrote into the Constitution for choosing the president. It turns out that Democrats winning 50% of the vote is typically not enough for them to win the presidency. The Electoral College has some structural factors in it, namely the overweighting or overrepresentation of smaller, more rural, and typically more Republican states, which means that Democrats will often need, according to this figure, again from The Economist, 53 or 54% of the vote, of the popular vote, to be confident that they can win the Electoral College. And you can see that if you trace along the bottom of the figure, find your way over to about 53 or 54 for Biden, and then trace upwards. That's what puts him over the 270 electoral vote mark. You might remember from 4 years ago that Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote. She had about 2.5% more than Trump, but that wasn't enough to win the Electoral College, of course, because she lost some key swing states, and that put her behind. So I feel extremely confident at this point in saying that Biden is a strong favorite for winning the popular vote if the election were now, but even if we're looking ahead to November. But his victory in the Electoral College is not as certain. And there are really a wide array of scenarios where Trump loses the popular vote, gets less than 50% of the popular vote, but nonetheless wins the Electoral College. So we need to keep that one in the back of our minds. So those are quick forecasts. If you just want a cheat sheet as to how things are going, I think that's a fair look at where things are today and what you're likely to see in November. But let's spend now a little time trying to unpack all the various forces that are beneath the surface there. And I do want to highlight both things that we know are regular patterns that are well understood, that we've seen in previous elections and should operate in a similar fashion in 2020, versus some new things, some factors that are really new to the scene and uncertain in terms of how they will play out. I think the public tends to focus on the uncertain things because they are new and obviously important, whereas the social scientists like me tend to rely on the old saws of the well understood patterns and then sort of think about the newer factors on top of those fundamentals. So what do we know well? We know about historical patterns of parties winning and losing election and what drives that. We also understand pretty exactly now how Trump put together his victory in the Electoral College in 2016, what the states were, what the social groups were that put him over the top despite losing the popular vote. So those things are known and are really the foundation for understanding what will happen in 2020. But then there are some new factors that I'm going to have less to say about because they're unfolding as we speak. One is that the economy is in a very unusual place with the shutdown of so many businesses and so many people out of work or being less productive. We are in territory of economic indicators that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. But our politics today is very different from the Great Depression, so it becomes hard to connect the dots. The pandemic is obviously the #1 story for most of us, and Trump's handling of it and the perception about how Biden might handle it, I think, are still being formed because the pandemic continues to unfold and has an unknown path ahead of us. And then the protests that have been spurred by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the reactions to it, the handling of it by police, by the White House and others, I think that too is still developing. And so I have a little less to say there because those are the things that are, I think still in development, but could be important, obviously, to tipping the balance one way or the other in November. So here's another historic pattern that we know generally holds, and that is that incumbent presidents have an advantage. If you know nothing else about an election, the expectation is that the incumbent will win re-election for a second term. What you see here is a table listing all of the elections since the first one where an incumbent was running for re-election. There are 32 cases of presidents running for re-election. And in 22 of them, adding Obama at the bottom there to update the table, the party kept the White House, was re-elected, and in only 10 of them they failed. So that's a success rate of about 70%. Right? And that's just what you would expect, all else constant. There is an advantage a kind of default or benefit of the doubt that goes to the incumbent party. And it really is rare, especially in modern times, for an incumbent to be defeated. The last example you can see on the right side of the screen is when George H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. That was a very strong swing against his party from the previous election, which he had won. Before that was 1980, when Jimmy Carter lost, also in a very strong swing against his party. He was defeated by Ronald Reagan. Before that, aside from Ford's loss to Carter, which was, I think, an exceptional case, Ford didn't win the presidency on his own. He had been elevated to it after Nixon resigned. The last time a president lost re-election was Herbert Hoover during the Depression. So I see only two real cases in the last 100 years where an incumbent president has lost re-election, which is why I say that first graph I showed you, which portrayed Trump as being so far behind and so consistently behind Joe Biden, is something of a surprise, because it's not where you would expect an incumbent president to be at this time. Now, maybe the swings that we saw in these elections where an incumbent was defeated in 1992 and in 1980, we shouldn't expect to see this year, because the electorate is now more polarized than it would have been in the 80s and 90s. And that really dampens the swings that we see back and forth. But nonetheless, the polls are indicating that Trump is in a very different place, maybe 7 or 8 points behind where he would have been 4 years ago. Okay, so these are historical patterns. We know our regularities. Another is to start with the baseline. This is the election 4 years ago that put Trump in office. This is a map of the Electoral College votes. Should look familiar to you, the pattern of red and blue states. The states that are colored kind of a flat red and flat blue are ones that voted in the same way in both 2012 and 2016. So states like Minnesota didn't flip. They voted consistently Democratic in both elections. Red states like Texas voted Republican for both Mitt Romney and Donald Trump. But there were 6 states that flipped. And you can see them marked with the diagonal lines. Our own Wisconsin is one of them, and there are several others that are crowded here in the upper Midwest: Iowa, Michigan, and Ohio. Again, only 6 states went from the Obama column to the Trump column. No states went the other way. And this was just enough for Trump to win the Electoral College. You can see up top that he needed 270 electoral votes to win. With this map, despite losing the popular vote by a few million votes, he earned just enough, 306 electoral votes, to be elected president. But several of these victories were really narrow wins. Between Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in particular, those 3 key swing states, which had been thought to be part of a blue wall that was protecting the Democrats, Trump won them combined by only 77,000 votes. All right, so 77,000 people could have made the difference in who won the presidency in 2016. For Democrats to win this year's election, they need to hold all of the blue states that already exist, but also win back those 3, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, or pick up 2 other large states like Florida and Pennsylvania. Those are the paths back to victory. And they're very much in the cards, because it would be quite challenging for Trump to repeat this exact configuration of states with the very narrow victories in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, especially without significant third-party candidates on the ballot, as there were in 2016. It just becomes a challenge, I think, for the lightning to strike twice. It's not impossible, but it's hard to see how all of this comes together in exactly the same way. So so these are the foundations, I think, kind of historical patterns and regularities you should expect that put Trump in a difficult position. Historically, even with the advantages that incumbent parties typically have, he has not reaped those for whatever set of reasons. So why don't we see what the public thinks of him to this point, and begin to speculate about how that will translate into votes in November. And the place we always begin in evaluating presidents is presidential approval. And we're going to go there in just a moment, but first I want to have a quick look at how some groups voted in 2016. So I'm going to show you here just a series of tables that come from the exit polls coming out of the 2016 election. These are surveys that some of you may have done of voters leaving the polling place who are asked who they voted for. and other characteristics of the voters. So let me just show you 4 or 5 different characteristics here. One is the kind of place people lived in. You can see that voters who lived in urban centers and cities voted for Clinton over Trump overwhelmingly, almost 2 to 1. And that Trump's real strength was in winning suburban areas by just enough, and then really pouring it on in rural communities, which are not as numerous, but nonetheless made a difference in states like Wisconsin. So there was definitely an urban-rural divide we should expect to be repeated this time around. There was also a substantial age differential. The Democratic voters 4 years ago were disproportionately young. Over 50%, 55%, especially of the youngest group, would have voted for Clinton. And that flips as you get into middle age, so that by the time you're into the oldest cohort of people 65 and older, a majority of them voted for Trump. That differential has been around now for about 15 or 20 years. And again, we should expect that kind of pattern in 2020. There are some big differences by race, but also by education in the interaction of those two. And here there's some really startling differences. Look just at the first 2 rows, which are limited to whites. The top row is whites who have graduated from college. They're about equally split between Clinton and Trump, just giving Trump the edge. But among whites who have not earned a college degree, they voted for Trump 66% to 29%, more than a 2 to 1 advantage. So Trump really cleaned up and really depended on those non-college white voters to put him over the top in states where they were pretty numerous. And you can see they made up about 1/3 of the electorate. Now, for non-white voters, education doesn't matter as much. In the bottom 2 rows, you can see that they were overwhelmingly on Clinton's side. We should expect that again in 2020. And then there was a gender gap. There has been one for a number of elections, and it showed up again in 2016. Trump won men, but lost women. He won white women, but it was thanks to non-white women that females ended up voting majority for Clinton. So these are sort of broad pieces, I think, that were important to 2016. I want to give you a sense for how they're likely to look different this time around. So what I'm showing you are exit polls from CNN. I now want to show you, just for a recent survey done by National Public Radio, how some of these groups are faring so far in 2020. So in a recent survey done by NPR, they asked people, are you likely to vote for Biden or Trump? And then asked them a variety of these demographic questions. We don't have all of them, but I will do a few comparisons. So let's take the age group, for example. In 2016, the youngest 3 cohorts voted substantially, but not overwhelmingly, for Clinton over Trump. This time around, it looks that they are more strongly in Biden's camp. It's about a 60-30 split of that group that's under 40. So young people are trending even more heavily towards the Democrats this time, which will work to Biden's advantage and make it tough for Trump to put together that coalition again. Up on the upper right-hand side of the graph, I've got the white college grads and the white non-grads. And there you can see that the split has really changed, especially for college graduates. And this is something that's, I think, unnoticed by a lot of people in American politics over the last 10 to 15 years. But there really has been a sorting out of Democratic and Republican voters by education level. As late as the 1990s, there wouldn't have been a difference between people with college or advanced degrees and people with only high school or some college under their belts. But the parties have begun to divide those voters, and you can see that going into 2020, the college grads are heavily, the white college grads are heavily on Biden's side, 57% to 37%. And the non-college grads are still on Trump's side. They would vote for him by majority for sure, but less enthusiastically. There's a little more balance this time around, again, putting Trump in some jeopardy. And then the gender gap down in the bottom right, it's bigger this time around, and is really tremendous, especially among female voters who are indicating in this survey that over 55% of them would vote for Biden. I've seen more recent surveys indicating that maybe as much as 60% of women would vote for Biden. So there is a challenge there for Trump because he's not getting as much out of the male vote as Biden is getting out of the female vote. And women are more numerous in the electorate and vote at higher rates. So that's trouble for Trump. So let's go where I promised a moment ago, which is to have a look at how the public is thinking about Trump. And we're going to start with the indicator everyone starts with. This is sort of the Dow Jones Industrial Average for American politics. This is the question asking whether people approve or disapprove of the way the president is handling his job. Presidential approval time series. And these are the records from all of those surveys that have been done during Trump's time in office, from January 2017 until yesterday, collected by the website 538. And what's remarkable, if you have not seen this kind of series for other presidents, is the amazing stability. Trump's disapproval rating has been above his approval rating, essentially from his honeymoon onward. I don't think many of us would think of this as an uneventful presidency, one without much happening. There was, after all, an impeachment and a whole variety of things that developed over the last 3.5 years. But the approval ratings don't reflect that. There has been a fairly consistent, and I would say moderately negative stance towards Trump in the electorate. Somewhat surprising. It looks like he has a low ceiling in terms of how much support he has in the electorate, but also a kind of high floor of supporters, 35 or 40% who are with him regardless, and he's really operated within that small band. The highest rating he's achieved during all of this time is 45%, which is lower than the percentage of the vote he earned 4 years ago. And you can see just in the last 2 weeks, his approval rating has been trending downward and is now close to the lowest it's been in his time in office. That's mostly a response to his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's when it began in early April, began the drop, and then a subsequent fall in response to his handling of the protest and the killing of George Floyd. So he has been paying a price over the last few weeks, and that, as you're going to see, puts him in some more jeopardy in 2020, because we know from past elections that approval ratings are a really reliable guide to how election outcomes are likely to turn out. The more people who approve of the president, the better you can expect him to do on election day. Let me show you some evidence of that. So what you see along the bottom is the approval rating for a president who was running for re-election anytime between Eisenhower back in 1956 up through Obama in 2012. And along the vertical axis, so up and down on the left-hand side, you see the share of the vote that the incumbent party won. And there's a very strong direct relationship. The more the public approves of your job handling, the more likely it is that you win a higher share of the vote on election day. Now, in this series of elections, there are 3 where the incumbent party lost and earned less of the vote, less than 50% of the vote. You can see them down on the left. One is 1988, one is 1980, and one, actually that should be 1992, 1980, and 1968. All of those are presidents whose ratings were in the 30s to low 40s. So this is now the territory where Trump finds himself at about 40 or 41% today and trending downward. So that puts him in the territory of those few presidents in recent decades who have lost re-election. It's not until a president gets to about 50% or well above that that they put themselves in a stronger position to win re-election. So Trump has been toying with this sort of cutting point or tipping point right around 45% approval rating that seems to be the divider between presidents who win and presidents who lose. So even though it may look to us as though the approval rating hasn't changed much in that previous figure, that he has been hovering in the low 40s throughout his time in office, a small change of a couple percentage points could make the difference between him falling below 50% of the vote, losing the Electoral College, and maybe being above 50% and winning the Electoral College. So these small differences do end up mattering a lot. So this is a pattern to watch going into election day. The other regularity besides approval ratings that political scientists know drives election results are the public's evaluations of the economy. The better the economy is doing, the more likely a president is to be reelected. Let me show you some evidence of that. But first, let me just mention this one fact about the approval rating. Not only is Trump in the low 40s, but there's a kind of asymmetry between those who approve of him, You can see those in the two bars on the left-hand side. More of them strongly approve than only somewhat approve. But among the people who disapprove of Trump's performance, they are overwhelmingly strongly feeling about that. So there's this imbalance where those who are opposed to Trump just have more intense feelings about it and are more certain than those who are with him. And that's a little bit of a difference from, say, Obama's reelection, where he was also underwater in terms of approval ratings often, but it didn't have this kind of imbalance to it, that those who disapproved just hated him or disapproved of his performance so much that it created this unevenness. So that's another factor that I think is new that maybe we have not accounted for in previous elections, but could drive turnout in particular of Democrats who are unhappy with Trump's performance. Okay, so as promised, let me show you the pattern with economic indicators and vote share. There are a lot of economic indicators we might look at. The one that turns out to predict elections pretty well is growth in GDP. You see that along the bottom. Positive numbers are cases where the economy is growing. So these would be numbers to the right of zero. The economy is almost always growing, so most of those elections are off on the right-hand side of the graph. And then along the y-axis, you have what we saw before, the share of the vote that the president in power wins. 2016 is not on the figure, but let me just point out where it would be. The growth rate at the time was about 2%. So find that on the horizontal line, and then just trace upwards to that diagonal line, and you'll see that it takes you right about to 50%. So right on the line would be the expectation. And that's just about where the 2016 election was. That was a very close election with Trump behind by a couple of percentage points and Clinton just ahead. So that line is just above 50. So 2016 was not exceptional at all in terms of economic indicators. And most elections end up sticking pretty close to the pattern. Now, the one election that's off to the left is 1980, where Jimmy Carter was suffering from stagflation and recession, and he and his party paid a big price in 1980, and that contributed to Reagan's big victory that year. Now, where does 2020 fit on this map? It doesn't. The indicator along the bottom is the second quarter GDP growth rate. So how fast is the economy growing in the quarter we're in right now, from April, May, and June? We don't have all the data from this quarter just yet, but economic forecasters are suggesting that growth this quarter could be anywhere from negative 20% to negative 50%. So we're talking about shrinkage of the economy that's not able to be plotted on this figure because it's far off to the left, well below that negative 10. So if that was the only thing driving this year's elections, you would expect Biden to win by a massive landslide, maybe as big as FDR's victory over Hoover back during the Depression in 1932. I suspect that that is an extreme enough value, and the circumstances this year are different enough that it won't play out exactly like that. But it should indicate to you that Trump is going to be challenged in trying to get all the mileage out of the economy that he might. Let me suggest one other thing about the economy, and that is some evidence that suggests that it's mattering less in recent years than it used to matter. That because of polarization and people's attachments to their partisanship, that fewer people are looking at economic indicators and having that drive their vote. So what you see here are the last dozen presidents lined up from Eisenhower to Trump. And along the bottom is a measure of economic confidence that comes from surveys that ask people, a random sample of Americans, what they think of the economy today. And along the vertical axis is the percentage of people who approve of the president. And you can see that for most presidents, when the economy is going better or perceptions of it are rosier, they tend to have higher approval ratings, and that translates into a better election for them. Take Bill Clinton, for example. You can see right in the middle at the bottom, there were times during his presidency when people were pretty favorable about the economy, and despite his other troubles, he had high approval ratings as a result. And when those ratings were lower, he performed less well. And that's true for almost all of these presidents. You can see that the dots sort of line up diagonally from the lower left to the upper right. But suddenly when we get to the Obama years, it stops. And although there were times during Obama's 8 years in office when people saw the economy as doing well or saw it doing poorly, his approval ratings didn't move much. It seemed to be that voters were sort of locked into their positions, and there was small territory where they were willing to move. That's also been the pattern with Donald Trump. We don't have as much data, there hasn't been as much movement, but you can see that his approval ratings just haven't budged. So that's, I think, a source of caution about the role that the terrible economic numbers from this quarter and maybe the next quarter and how they will translate into election outcomes. Let's look at his approval ratings in other areas. Surveys do ask the public what they think of Trump's handling of a variety of topics. We've already seen his overall approval rating, which has him in the low 40s. You can see this is from a recent YouGov survey, which puts him at 41% approval. That's a bad place to be as a president. The other one that people often look at frequently is approval of his handling of jobs and the economy. And this is one place where Trump is actually on top. His approval rating is better than his disapproval rating. So even today, with the economy as it is, more people say he's doing a good job in handling it than doing a poor job. But his overall approval rating is somehow not picking that up. So he's being punished in other ways that are something bigger than the economy. In fact, in all of these other issue areas, civil rights, healthcare, immigration, terrorism, his approval rating is lower than his disapproval rating. It's only the economy where the public broadly thinks he's doing well, or more people think he's doing the right thing than doing the wrong thing. So it does seem to me that the economy is going to be a central issue, and the framing of who's responsible for the downturn and the closings and how much of it will rebound by November is going to be really important. Okay, so that's the presidential election. Before we wrap up, I want to take a quick look at the other elections this year. The presidency is not the only thing on the ballot. We do, after all, have elections for every single seat in the House of Representatives this November and a third of the Senate. So let's have a quick look at both of those. In the House of Representatives today, Democrats have a firm majority of about 36 seats. They won that in 2018, just 2 years ago, after being in the minority. So Democrats would obviously like to hold that and have a majority working with a majority president. The Senate is another story. Republicans there held on to their majority. They have 53 of the seats, despite the bad result for them generally in 2018. Democrats have 47 seats. They have 45 real Democrats and then 2 others who caucus with them. That's Bernie Sanders and Angus King from Maine, who aren't officially Democrats but are part of that coalition. So if Democrats were to try to win back the Senate, they would need at least 3 seats to get to 50. Then they would need Joe Biden to win the presidency so that his vice president would serve as the tiebreaker in the Senate. That's the bare minimum. It's 3 seats in the Senate. If Republicans were hopeful about winning back the House of Representatives, they would need about 18 seats to get back the majority that they had 2 years ago. What's likely to happen in both of these cases? Well, let's start by looking at the House of Representatives. There are surveys that ask people generically whether they're likely to vote for a Democrat or Republican for the House this year. This figure shows the trend in that from 538 from really early last year until today. And you can see that many more people say they're likely to vote for the Democrat for Congress than the Republican. It's about an 8 percentage point gap. And just for context, that's about where things ended up at the end of the 2018 election cycle. And that was an election that resulted in Democrats winning the majority they now have in the House. So this suggests a pretty strong position for Democrats going in. The Republicans also have the additional problem of having a lot of retirees. There are just a larger number of Republicans who are calling it quits and leaving their seats open, which provides an opportunity for Democrats to try to take those back since there won't be an incumbent in the seat. Democrats have many more seats to defend because they're then the majority, and some of those seats are actually in places that Trump won. A prime example would be the district in the western part of Wisconsin held by Ron Kind, a long-term Democrat who's had that seat for a number of years, but it's also a part of the state where Trump was victorious. So Democrats are going to be fighting battles to try to hold off the Trump support in places where they have Democratic incumbents who may be in some jeopardy. So that's the situation in the House. Democrats are running ahead, but Democrats shouldn't be too enthusiastic about these polling numbers because they do not translate into seats in Congress in the way you might expect. In fact, an analysis by some political scientists suggests that just like in the Electoral College, Democrats need to have a pretty big majority in order to be confident about winning a majority of seats. So let me show you how that analysis works out in this figure on the right. So along the bottom, you have the percentage of people telling us in polls that they would vote for the Democratic candidate. And those two lines show you how far above 50% the Democrats need to be just to break even to win a majority of the seats in the House, which would be 218 seats. And those lines cross that crucial point at about 53 to 54%. So of the two-party vote, Democrats winning half of it or slightly more than half probably results in them being a minority in the Congress, in large part because of the way that districts are drawn. They're configured in a way that gives Republicans some natural advantages, similar to the way the Electoral College does. I think Democrats today are in a position to be in that territory where they're likely to hold the majority, but it is a concern. Being ahead in the polls is just not enough for Democrats when it comes to the House. But nonetheless, I think in a good position to keep the majority. The Senate is a little more interesting and complicated. Only a third of the seats are up in 2020. That's by design. 1/3 of the seats are up in each election cycle. Most of them are not in doubt because we know that voters vote for Senate just the way they vote for president. In fact, in 2018, there were no states that had a split out, or in 2016, there were no states that had a split outcome where one party won the presidency in the state and another won the Senate seat in that state. There's essentially zero ticket splitting going on. Now, Republicans have a bit of a challenge in that of the 33 or 30, I guess actually 35 with a couple of additional states thrown in, they have more seats to defend just by chance, because this cycle reflects senators who were elected 6 years ago. In 2014, that was a very good year for Republicans. They won lots of seats they might not have otherwise won, and now they're in a difficult position of having to defend those. There's only one seat that looks likely for a pickup for Republicans, and that is Doug Jones, who won a special election in Alabama. That's a very red state, but he's a Democrat. It's the one blue state there in the Deep South, you can see. He's likely to lose that seat this year. But Democrats have lots of opportunities for pickups, and there are really 4 states that people are looking at closely. One is Arizona, where astronaut Mark Kelly is challenging Senator Martha McSally. Another is in Colorado, where John Hickenlooper, who used to be the Democratic governor, is challenging Senator Cory Gardner. A third is in Maine, where Susan Collins, who's a moderate Republican, is being challenged by a Democrat who used to be the Speaker of the House there and is well known. And then in North Carolina, Senator Tom Tillis is in some trouble in that swing state. So those are 4 states that are really on the map for the Democrats, I think are possible, if not likely, pickups for them. And that would be enough to put them in the majority, assuming Democrats win the White House and Doug Jones loses that Alabama Senate seat. Just in the last few days, there have been some new polls indicating some additional states where Republicans may be in trouble that they hadn't expected to be. And that's partly because numbers for Donald Trump have been sinking during this time, and it's been bringing down other Republicans. One example is in our neighboring state of Iowa, where Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican, looked like a shoo-in to win re-election, but is now in some trouble and has a strong opponent who's raising a good amount of money and has some traction in that swing state. So the Senate now looks like there's a wider range of possibilities with some potential for big wins by Democrats. It wouldn't be out of the question for them to pick up 5 or 6 seats and have a majority there. Not a filibuster-proof majority, but a majority to run the chamber in some ways. So that's a look at the House and the Senate, and does bring me to the end of the formal part of the talk. I do just want to say by way of wrapping up is that I'm the director of the Elections Research Center, as was mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We're a nonpartisan institute at the university. If you like this kind of analysis, we do lots of this sort of thing, presentations and data collection and events on and off campus. We've been doing polling in this election year. You may have seen some of the polls we did back in February around the time of the Iowa caucuses and Super Tuesday. We'll have more surveys of Wisconsin and 2 other swing states coming out later this month, and then a whole spate of them coming out between July and Election Day. So watch for those. We do also have a website you might be interested in visiting. It's elections.wisc.edu. If you're interested in checking that out. And we have both Twitter and Facebook accounts if you want to follow our activities online in kind of a passive way. So that's the end of the formal talk, and I'd be glad to take your questions. If you want to find your way to the chat function, which depending on what kind of platform you're on is probably at the top or bottom of the screen. It might be under the More button. How about I stop sharing my screen and give you just a moment to enter some questions there. All right, I see a few building. These can be on either topics that I covered during the presentation or other things that are maybe a little less sciencey and a little more political. That's fine. So I see a question here from Reg. Who tends to vote and how can that affect the presidential election? It's a great question. We know who tends to vote. The most likely voters are people who are older, who are more educated, have higher incomes, and who are partisan. If you tell me somebody's age and whether they think of themselves as a Democrat or Republican or not, more often than not, I can tell you whether they're likely to vote. In fact, the rough rule of thumb we use is that your likelihood of voting is proportional to your age. So about 70% of 70-year-olds are likely to vote this November, about 30% of 30-year-olds. So it really does increase, your tendency to vote does increase in a pretty dramatic fashion over the life cycle. Democrats, of course, need those young voters because those are their strongest supporters nowadays. And so they're going to be watching that group very closely. That was a group that sagged a little bit in 2016 and helped contribute to Trump's victory. There is also a difference between voters with higher and lower levels of education. If a voter has a college degree, they're very likely to be voters. If they have something less than that, unlikely to be voters. That is also a challenge for Trump because he depends on those less educated white voters. That was part of his coalition in Wisconsin and some other key swing states. So who votes is just as important as knowing what direction they're likely to vote, because demographics tend to be predictive of both things. Okay, I see a great question here. What lessons have we learned about polling since 2016? We have learned some. Let me say a few words about the polling in 2016. You might be surprised to hear that at the national level, the polls were actually more accurate in 2016 than they had been in any prior election. They were more accurate than in 2012 and in 2008 and 2004. The average of the polls right before Election Day was predicting that Clinton would win by 3 to 4 percentage points. She won by about 2.5. That's within the margin of error. That's good enough for most of us. Where they failed was in some states. The state polling was not accurate of what voters actually did on Election Day. And Wisconsin was actually the worst state in the country for the mismatch between what the polls were saying at the end and how the vote came out. The vote ended up being 7 or 8 points more favorable to Trump than polls indicated. Now, why is that? One reason is that some of the state polls are not of very high quality. They're done by kind of fly-by-night operations you haven't heard of. They swoop into a state and do a survey very quickly to make some news or make some money. And it becomes part of the conversation, but actually isn't very scientific, doesn't have the same kind of credibility that other surveys do. Another factor is that surveys in the states tend to stop about a week to 10 days before Election Day. The Marquette poll, which is the most trusted survey in Wisconsin, stopped on, I think, around October 25th or so. But of course, the campaign continued and voters continued to make up their minds. We now have pretty good evidence that there was movement right at the end of the campaign in Trump's direction. Late-breaking voters were mostly Trump voters. So it's not so much in that case that the polls were wrong, it's that they captured a moment in time that didn't look exactly like it did on Election Day because the electorate had evolved in those final 10 days or so. You might remember that the infamous letter from James Comey, the FBI director, also appeared during that time. So there were campaign events that were happening, even though the polling had stopped. I'll just mention one other improvement to polling that's happened since 2016. Polls that did not account for educational disparities in their samples have now mostly made those corrections. So in the past, pollsters were better able to do interviews with more educated people than with less educated people. And that wasn't a problem because the voting patterns of more educated people looked a lot like the voting patterns of people without college degrees. But by 2016, that gulf opened up so that college grads were mostly Clinton voters and non-college grads were mostly Trump voters. And many surveys had too many college grads in their interview pool and not enough people with less education. So good surveys, including the surveys that my center does, now weight the samples by education to make sure that it reflects the electorate in terms of that indicator. Okay, we got a few questions here. Let's see. I see a question, if the Elections Commission sends absentee ballot forms to all registered voters in the state, how will this affect the election? My understanding is they are going to do that. I think there was just a vote yesterday at the Elections Commission to send almost everyone, it's about 2.7 million registrants in the state, an absentee ballot application form. I don't think many people are going to use that form itself. It's a paper form. A voter would have to complete it and produce a photocopy of their ID along with that paper form. Not a lot of us have access to a copy machine or scanner or something at this time that could provide that. And then it has to be mailed in with postage in an envelope that the voter has to provide. So I think it's a small number of people who will do that. But I do think the letter that's going out with the form will be a reminder or a notice to a lot of voters that, hey, the election's coming. If you want to vote by absentee, there are some steps you need to take in advance. You have to be registered. You have to request the absentee ballot, and most people are going to do that online. And then when the ballot comes, you've got to mark it, get the signatures, and get it back on time so that it's counted. So it is actually a fairly complicated multi-stage process that I think a lot of voters just don't realize because it's a new thing for so many of us. So many of us have jumped into mail voting this year. And I think the letters will be helpful in preventing some voters from missing the deadlines or missing some of the steps along the way, which are more complicated and more cumbersome than voting in person. Let's see, I think we can do one or two more questions, if that's all right, if our library folks will let us go along. Let's see, polling. How does Trump's behavior fit into the election decision? Is that important? Yes and no. If you look back 4 years ago, Trump's approval rating was actually lower, his favorability rating rather, because he wasn't president, was lower than it is today. People were more negative about him. And so you might be surprised to hear that people are more favorable towards Trump today than they were then. The main reason is that Republicans have come around to Trump. There were lots of Republican voters who were skeptical of Trump during the 2016 primaries. They would have rather seen Ted Cruz or Scott Walker or Marco Rubio or someone be the nominee. And so they were resisting Trump, and many of them eventually went along. The vast majority eventually went along with him on election day because of their distaste for Hillary Clinton. But so many Republicans have now, at least over time, evolved to come around to support Trump. As he often tweets, his approval ratings among Republicans are 90 to 95% in most surveys. And his disapproval ratings among Democrats are about as high as well. So there's just a lot of partisan attachment going on. And it means that a lot of Republicans have, I think, gotten used to his non-traditional, somewhat belligerent, aggressive governing style, the things he says that offend other Republicans, including other Republican elected officials. I think a lot of Republican voters, in fact, the vast majority, have come to accept as a kind of trade-off to get the things they're getting from the Trump presidency. If you're a conservative voter in America today, on policy grounds, Trump is your person. He has enacted substantial income tax cuts. He has rolled back a number of regulations. He has appointed a record number of federal judges who are conservative. He has been a defender of the pro-life stance on abortion and a defender of gun rights and a variety of other things that are near and dear to conservative hearts. Joe Biden is not going to be any of those things. So, you know, for most voters, the style is problematic and is less appealing now than it was 4 years ago. But at least for hardcore Republicans, they, I think, are really supportive of the policy things they're getting out of the Trump administration and are going to be so resistant to Biden that the governing style is a factor. And it's definitely a price that Trump will pay. I'm just not sure that it's going to be the most important factor. Let's see. Other questions? Did late-breaking voters in 2016 really decide for Trump at the last minute, or were they lying to us or hiding their preference for Trump? Boy, I want to believe that there was lying or misreporting to survey takers like me, but it's hard to find the evidence of the so-called shy Trump voter. There are surveys that track the same set of people over time, what are called panel surveys. And we don't find a lot of evidence of people who are hiding their preference for Trump and then revealing it on election day at the polling place. We don't find that in areas where Trump did better, there were fewer people answering our surveys. I think there is good evidence that voters were less enthusiastic about voting for Trump. Even those who supported him weren't excited about doing so in a lot of cases. And there is a kind of enthusiasm differential that we see in surveys, that people who are more excited about what's happening are more likely to answer our surveys, and that tends to skew the results in one direction or the other. And I would say right now, Joe Biden is having a great time in the polls. He's riding high. As you saw in the very first slide, he's now 8 or 9 points ahead of Trump. Democrats generally are doing well in the polls. Some of that is genuine, and some of that is just that Democrats are feeling good about their chances and they really like answering surveys right now. And Republicans are holding their preferences back just a little bit. I think that's different than a person doing a survey but not wanting to reveal that they're a Trump supporter. One other fact on this, there wasn't a lot of evidence that people who did surveys on the internet were more likely to reveal they were Trump voters than people who were doing surveys on the phone talking to a human. You might think if a person was shy about that, they wouldn't be willing to tell an interviewer, I'm a Trump voter, but they would be willing to click a box on a web form. And there was just a hair of evidence that was happening, probably not enough to cause the big movement we saw in places like Wisconsin and Michigan. Okay, I think we're pushing near the end of our time. We're just about an hour into this, which is as long as most of us can handle to be on a screen in a seminar like this. I really do appreciate your attention and time. Thanks for the terrific questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but I do appreciate your interest. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Burden. This was fantastic, and we are so appreciative that you took the time to talk with us tonight. And for anyone else who is interested about the work that Professor Burden does, check out the website, elections.wisc.edu. It's over in the chat. And please take a look at our event calendar to see what we've got coming up. Our next event in this series is July 9th, and that is on the future of the Supreme Court. So that should be a good one as well. Thank you again to Professor Burden, and thank you all. Have a great night.